I want you to imagine the worst thing a person can hear. And then I want you to imagine hearing it in a room full of people who used to clap for you. That was my Tuesday. My name is Wren Calloway, and for 3 years I was the wife of Dorian Ashford, son of the Hollow Pine Pack's elder council. I say wife, the old way, the pack way, the kind sealed under a winter moon with both families watching. People in our valley don't divorce. They don't break a bond like a cheap chain. A bond is supposed to hold until one of you is in the ground. That's what I believed. That's what I built my whole small life on. So when Dorian stood up in the longhouse that evening and asked the council to release him from me, I actually laughed. A short, ugly little sound. I thought it was a joke. I thought maybe he was drunk on the harvest wine, the way half the men got that time of year. He wasn't drunk. His eyes were clear. That's the part I keep coming back to. He wasn't even angry. He just looked at me the way you look at a coat that doesn't fit anymore. Let me back up. You need to understand the place first, or none of the rest will land right. Hollow Pine sits in a long fold of mountains where the pines grow so thick the light comes down green. There's a river that never warms up, even in summer, and a bridge of black stone that the old wolves say has been there longer than any name we have for it. We're a pack, yes, that kind. Shifters, wolves under the skin. But day to day we lived like any mountain village. We baked bread and mended fences and gossiped at the well. The fur was for the full moons and the hunts and the bad winters. Mostly, we were just people who knew each other's business too well. I came to Hollow Pine when I was 19. My own pack, far to the south, had fallen apart after a sickness took half of us. I arrived with one bag and a bad cough, and Dorian's mother took me in because that's the kind of thing she did to look generous in front of the others. Dorian was tall and golden and the whole valley wanted him. When he picked me, the southern girl with nothing, I felt like I'd won a lottery I hadn't even bought a ticket for. I should have noticed how much he liked being wanted, but you don't see those things when you're 19 and grateful. We married, and for a while it was good or good enough. He was charming when guests came, cold when they left, but I told myself that was just how some men were, private, tired. I made his house warm. I learned every herb in the back hills. The whole village would come to me when a child had fever or an old joint locked up. I was useful. I thought useful was the same as loved. The trouble started with the bobbies, or the lack of them. 3 years no child. In a pack, that's not a private sorrow. It's public arithmetic. People count. Dorian's mother counted out loud. Every season she'd find a new way to say it, a comment about the cradle gathering dust, a remedy left on my step like a stone. I tried everything. I drank bitter things. I prayed to gods I'm not even sure we have. I let an old healer from over the ridge press cold hands to my belly and shake her head. And the whole time, nobody once asked whether the problem might be Dorian. That's the thing nobody says out loud in a place like ours. The woman is always the empty field. The man is never the bad seed. I knew, deep down, that we'd never know whose fault it was because no one would ever dare suggest it was his. His name was too shiny. Mine was just borrowed. So back to the longhouse. It was the autumn gathering, when the whole pack crowds in under the big rafters and the council settles the year's disputes, land lines, debts, who insulted whose grandmother. I was sitting near the back where I always sat, mending a child's torn sleeve because I can't keep my hands still. The fire was loud. The room smelled like wet wool and apple smoke. Dorian stood, and he said my name, and then he said the words. He asked to be released. He said a man of his blood needed heirs, that the line couldn't end with him, that he'd been patient, he said, like he'd done me a favor, and that the bond had failed to bear fruit, and so the bond should end. The room went so quiet I could hear the fire spit. I stood up too. I don't remember deciding to. My legs just did it. I said his name, just his name. I think I was waiting for him to laugh, to take it back, to say, "You should have seen your face." He didn't look at me. He looked at the council. And the elders, these people I'd healed, whose grandchildren I'd pulled through fever, they looked at the floor. Every single one of them. His mother sat in the front with her chin up, already wearing a small, satisfied smile, like the end of a job done right. The eldest of the council, a man called Bram with a beard like gray moss, finally spoke. He said the council would consider it, but everyone in that room already knew. Consider it was just the polite cloth they'd throw over the thing while it died. I want to tell you I said something powerful. I want to tell you I made them all feel small. The truth is I just stood there with a child's torn sleeve still in my hand, and I said, very quietly, 3 years. I gave you 3 years and everything I had. And Dorian, this is the part, Dorian finally looked at me and he said, and it wasn't enough. I left the longhouse before they could finish. I didn't run. I want that on the record. I walked. Out the big doors, down the steps, into the cold that hit me like a wall. The stars were doing that hard, bright thing they do up there in autumn. I could hear the river. I stood on the black bridge for a long time, long enough that my hands stopped feeling like mine. I won't pretend I didn't think dark thoughts on that bridge. I did. The water was right there, loud and patient. But I have this stubborn streak. My mother had it too. The river was cold and the night was long, and I thought, if I go in, the last thing anyone says about me is the empty one. And something in me just refused to give them that ending. So I went home, to his home, technically, and I started packing my one bag, the same one I came with, because I knew the way these things went. By the new moon, I'd be told to leave. Better to choose it than be swept out like dust. That's where part one of my story usually ends when I tell it. Rejected, counted, found wanting. A woman walking back across a black bridge with one bag. But that's not where my story ends, because 3 things happened that I didn't see coming. The first was a knock on my door at dawn. The second was a stranger on the ridge who I'd later learn was a king. And the third was the slow, terrible discovery of what Dorian and his mother had actually been hiding all those years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell it the way it happened. The knock came just as the sky was going from black to that bruised gray before sunrise. I'd barely slept. My bag was packed and sitting by the cold hearth like a guest who'd worn out their welcome. I figured it was one of the council, come to make it official, or worse, Dorian's mother, come to gloat in person. I opened the door already braced for it. It was Tilda. Tilda was the baker's wife, a round, fierce little woman who'd lost 3 bobbies of her own before she had the 2 that lived. She'd never said much to me, but she was standing on my step with a cloth bundle in her arms and her jaw set hard, and before I could speak, she pushed past me into the house like she owned it. "Don't you dare leave on that bridge," she said. "Not in the dark, not where they can say you slunk off." I told her I wasn't planning anything stupid. She gave me a long look that said she didn't quite believe me. Then she unwrapped the bundle. Bread, still warm, a wedge of hard cheese, a little clay pot of honey, trail food, the kind you give someone who's leaving. "You're not staying," she said. It wasn't a question. "Even if they let you, you can't stay here. It'll be a little death every day. I've watched it happen to women before." I sat down hard on the bench. I think that was the first time I cried, sitting there with a baker's wife and a loaf of bread, the whole night finally catching up to me. Tilda didn't fuss. She just put a heavy hand on my shoulder and let me get it out. Then she told me something I'll never forget. She said, "Ren, do you know why I never came to you for a remedy when I lost my little ones, even though you helped half this valley?" "I didn't." "Because I knew it wasn't your medicine they doubted," she said. "It was you. They needed someone to be the curse. And a southern girl with no family to stand behind her, you were easy. You hear me? It was never about your body. It was about your name being cheap enough to throw away." That landed in me like a hook, because I'd felt it for years and never let myself say it. She told me there was a healer's lodge 3 days' walk north and east past the high pass near the king's seat, a place where women who knew the old craft were taken in regardless of pack or blood. They needed hands. Mine were good hands. She'd heard about it from a peddler. She pressed a few coins into my palm, coins a baker's wife could not really spare, and she said, "Go before the sun's full up. Go before they make a show of throwing you out. Take that from them, at least." So I did. I left Holopine in the gray hour with my one bag and a loaf of warm bread, and I crossed the black bridge in the dawn light instead of the dark. A small thing, but it felt like the difference between drowning and swimming. The first 2 days of the walk were just cold and ache and the strange, hollow lightness of having nothing left to lose. I slept under a rock overhang the first night and in an abandoned shepherd's hut the second. I talked to myself a lot. I think grief makes everyone a little mad for a while. It was on the third day, on the high pass, that I met the stranger. The pass is a narrow thing, the wind funneling through it hard enough to lean on. I came around a shoulder of rock, and there he was, a man crouched at the edge of the trail beside a fallen horse. The horse had gone down on the ice and broken its leg. You could see it wrong-angled in the snow, see the animal's breath coming fast and frightened. The man was big, dark-haired, wrapped in a plain travel cloak with the hood back. No fine clothes, no guards. Just a man alone on a mountain with a dying horse and a face like a closed door. He looked up at me. I should have been scared. A woman alone, a strange man, a remote pass. Every story warns you about exactly that. But there was something in how he was kneeling by that horse, one hand flat on its neck, talking to it low, that made the fear quiet down. "It's the leg," he said, like we were already mid-conversation. "I can't carry it down and I can't leave it to the cold." I knew what he meant. There's only one mercy for a horse like that, and it's a hard one. I came and knelt by the animal's head. I've put down plenty of beasts up in the hills, you learn to, but I also know how to make the going easier. I had dried valerian and a few other things in my bag. I made the horse drink what I could, talked to it the way you talk to anything that's afraid, and when the stranger did the necessary thing with his knife, the animal barely struggled. It went quiet under my hands. I held its head until it was over. The man sat back in the snow and looked at me for a long moment. "You've a steady hand," he said. "I've had practice," I said. We made a small fire in the lee of the rocks because neither of us could go on right away, him grieving the horse, me just bone-tired. I shared Tilda's bread. He had dried meat and a flask of something that burned going down. We didn't say much at first, but there's a thing that happens between strangers on a mountain that doesn't happen anywhere else. The usual rules fall away. You tell the truth because you'll never see them again. He asked where I was headed and why a woman walked the high pass alone in autumn, and I told him all of it. The longhouse, the counting, Dorian's clear, unbothered eyes, the word infertility thrown over me like a sentence. The bridge, the bread. I don't know why I told a stranger what I'd barely told myself. Maybe because he didn't flinch. He just listened, feeding the little fire, his jaw tight. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said something that I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. He said they measured your worth by the one thing you couldn't give them, and called the smallness theirs to keep. He looked at me. "That's not a flaw in you. That's a flaw in them. A pack that throws away a healer because she hasn't borne a son yet, that pack is already rotting at the root. It just doesn't smell it yet." I asked him what he knew about packs. He smiled, a tired, crooked thing. "More than I'd like," he said, and he told me his name was Cass, just Cass. I told him mine. We shook hands like two ordinary travelers, and I thought that was the end of it. We walked down off the pass together the next morning. He was headed the same direction, toward the king's seat. He carried my bag part of the way, over my objections, and we argued about nothing and laughed a little. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt like a person instead of a problem. At the fork where the Healer's Lodge road split off, he stopped. He looked like he wanted to say something and thought better of it. Instead, he reached into his cloak and gave me a small carved token, a wolf's head, dark wood, worn smooth. "If anyone gives you trouble at the lodge," he said, "show them this. They'll treat you right." I thanked him. I thought it was just a kind man's keepsake. I took the lodge road, and he took the high road, and I didn't look back because I was afraid I'd cry again, and I was tired of crying. The lodge was everything Tilda promised. A long timber hall, smoke rising from the chimneys, the smell of drying herbs so thick it made my eyes water in the best way. The women there asked no questions about whose I'd been or what I hadn't done. They asked only one thing: what can you do? And when I showed them, when I set a herder's broken arm cleaner than their own healer could have, when I brought down a child's killing fever that had everyone else wringing their hands, they simply nodded and made room for me at the table. For the first time in my life, I was wanted for what I could do, not what I could produce. I didn't show anyone the token. I'd half forgotten it, tucked in my bag. I was happy, or close to it. I had work and a bed and women who didn't look at my belly like a failed harvest. And then 3 weeks in, riders came up the lodge road. A dozen of them in dark gray, mounted on good horses, with a banner I didn't recognize, a black wolf's head on a field of pine green. The same wolf's head as the token in my bag. The lodge mistress went pale and started smoothing her apron. The women whispered, and I asked the nearest one what was happening, and she looked at me like I'd asked which way was up. "The king," she said, "Caspian Thorn, the Alpha King. He's come to the lodge himself. That's never happened, not once in my life." My stomach dropped through the floor. Caspian Cass. The man with the dying horse and the steady eyes. The man who'd carried my bag and told me a rotting pack just doesn't smell it yet. The man I'd shared a loaf of bread with on a mountain. The king of every pack in the north, including, I realized with a cold rush, Holopine. He came into the lodge hall with the cold air still on him, ducking under the low door, and the whole room dropped into bows and curtsies like a field of grass under wind. I didn't bow, I couldn't move. I just stood there holding a basket of dried yarrow like a fool. He scanned the room once and his eyes found me, and his closed-door face cracked open into something almost boyish. "There you are," he said, like he'd been looking for a misplaced glove. "You never showed them the token." The lodge mistress made a small choking sound. I found my voice from somewhere. "I didn't need it," I said. "They took me for my hands, not my acquaintances." He laughed, a real one that turned heads, and said, "Of course you did. I should tell you what I learned in the days that followed, because it changes everything, and it's the part that still makes my blood go hot when I think on it." Caspian hadn't just wandered up the high pass for fun. He'd been traveling the territories quietly in plain clothes, the way the old kings used to see his packs as they really were, not the polished show they put on when royalty was expected. He'd been to Holopine, days before I crossed the pass, in fact. He'd sat at the back of that same longhouse, unrecognized, a traveler passing through. He had been there the night Dorian asked to be released from me. He'd watched the whole thing. He'd watched the elders study the floor. He'd watched a mother smile while her son threw away his wife in front of the pack. And this is the part. He'd watched me stand up with a child's torn sleeve in my hand and say, 3 years. I gave you everything I had, and then walk out with my spine straight when most people would have crumbled. He told me, much later, that he'd left Holopine that very night thinking about that straight spine, that he'd ridden out before dawn and pushed his horse too hard on the ice trying to clear his head, which is how the poor animal ended up with a broken leg on the pass, which is how he ended up kneeling in the snow when a southern girl with a loaf of bread came around the rock. He hadn't told me who he was on the mountain because, he said, for once in his life someone had spoken to him like a man and not a crown, and he hadn't wanted to lose that. I understood. God knows I understood wanting to be seen as a person instead of a category. Now, here's where I have to be honest, because I promised you the truth and not a fairy tale. It would be a lovely, tidy thing to tell you the king swept in and married me on the spot, and we lived happy ever after. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and stranger and better. What happened first was the matter of Holopine. Because Caspian, being king, could not let what he'd seen simply stand. Not for my sake, he was careful to say that, and I respected it. For the sake of the law. A pack that discards its healers, he said, is a pack that has forgotten what packs are for. So he sent word back down the mountain that the Council of Hollowpine was to be reviewed. And in that review, the truth came out. The truth I never knew. The third thing I told you about at the start. It turned out Dorian's mother had known for years that the fault was never mine. There was an old healer, the one who'd pressed her cold hands to my belly and shaken her head. She'd been paid to shake her head. Because Dorian's mother had buried 2 daughters-in-law's worth of the same problem long ago in Dorian's own father's line, and she knew exactly where the empty field really was. The line had a flaw in it, and it was the men's, not the women's. She'd known. And rather than let that shame touch her shining sun, she'd built a story where I was the broken thing, and she'd paid to keep that story standing. 3 years. I'd drunk bitter things and prayed to half-real gods and let myself be measured and found wanting, and the woman who measured me had known the whole time that the scale was rigged. When that came out, something in me that had been clenched for years finally let go. It wasn't triumph. It was quieter than that. It was just relief. The relief of a person who's been told 100 times she's the problem, finally hearing out loud in front of everyone, "It was never you." The council was broken up. The old men who'd studied the floor were sent home in disgrace. Dorian's mother lost the standing she'd murdered my marriage to protect. And Dorian sent me a letter, a long one, full of soft words and second thoughts, now that the wind had changed and the southern girl was suddenly walking with kings. I read it once. Then I used it to start the morning fire. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because a thing that's dead is dead, and warming yourself on its ashes is the only honest use left for it. As for Caspian and me, that took years, not weeks. I stayed at the lodge. I wasn't about to trade one man's house for another, even a king's, just because he'd been kind on a mountain. I'd done that once. I told him as much plainly. And instead of being offended, he looked almost relieved. He said he'd never trusted anyone who wanted the crown more than the person under it. So he courted me the slow way. He'd come to the lodge under the pretense of pack business and end up holding bandages while I worked. He learned the names of herbs. He was clumsy at it and laughed at himself. He never once asked me about children, not because the question didn't matter to a king's line, but because he'd decided, he said, that he would rather have a partner who saw clearly than a womb that performed on command. And if the line needed an heir, well, there were cousins, there were ways, there was time. A pack isn't a bloodline, he told me once. A pack is who shows up. You showed up for a dying horse that wasn't even yours. That's worth more than any blood I know of. We married in the end. Under a winter moon, the old way, but smaller than you'd think for a king. Just the lodge women and a few of his people and Tilda, who I sent for, and who cried louder than anyone and then ate more cake than 3 men. I'm still a healer. I run the lodge now, the very one that took me in with 1 bag and a borrowed loaf of bread. We've taken in dozens of women since, women thrown out for being barren, for being foreign, for being inconvenient, for being counted and found wanting by people whose own scales were rigged. I tell every one of them the same thing Tilda told me. It was never about your body. It was about someone needing you to be the curse so they wouldn't have to be. People in the valleys tell my story now like it's a romance. The rejected wife and the alpha king. And I let them, because it makes them feel good, and stories should make people feel good sometimes. But that's not really the story. The real story isn't that a king saw my worth. The real story is that I was worth something the whole time, on the cold bridge, in the empty house, on the long walk north with 1 bag. And the only thing that changed is that I finally stopped waiting for the people who threw me away to be the ones who told me so. Here's the thing I've learned, and it's the last thing I'll say. They measured me by the one thing I couldn't give. And the moment I stopped letting their scale be the only scale, I weighed exactly what I'd always weighed. A whole person, steady hands and all.